was. It was Amale and I were just talking. It was a 4-year project that involved many people, and it was. I'm not sure it was a work of love, but it was a big. There was a lot of pieces, and I would like to start by describing how and why this book came into being. Then Amale and I will talk about some of the book's highlights. As you know, I'm the editor of The Women Who Changed Architecture, a project that got underway with Princeton Architectural Press in 2018. How it started is one day, I was an acquisitions editor, meaning that I was responsible for bringing in or creating projects, and so I began Googling general architectural subjects. Architects under 40, architects at 80, architects top award winners, and I soon recognized that 95% or more of the names that came up were men. 4 decades before, as a woman studying the history of architecture in the 1970s, I was alert to the imbalance in the printed knowledge about women and men designers. My growing discovery that women in architecture were underrepresented in publications and therefore presently online led me to develop this collective biography of the women who changed architecture through the ages. I knew they existed. I knew of the influential work they had done. I also knew that many of their stories were buried under the weight of their dominant and more prominent male peers. Until as recently as last year, the teaching of architectural history was about the men who designed remarkable buildings or introduced innovative techniques and styles. This book will change the history of architecture. It will bring female architects into the central narrative. Students will now hear about Lily Wright's pivotal role in the design of Mies van der Rohe's world-renowned chairs and the Barcelona Pavilion, and Anne Ting's hand in the interior design of Louis Kahn's Yale University Art Gallery and Design Center, at the very least, widely regarded as his first significant commission and his breakthrough masterpiece. And what about the many female associates of Frank Lloyd Wright's studio? These women are the unsung heroes. Now, at least 22 women architects in this book, of 122, actually do have monographs or books about them and their work, including Mary Coulter, Julia Morgan, Eileen Gray, Charlotte Perrion, Florence Noel Bassett, Phyllis Lambert, Denise Scott Brown, Judith Chafee, Billy Chen, Zaha Hadid, Patricia Patkau, Elizabeth Potter-Zeiber, Toshiko Mori, Elizabeth Diller, Maya Lin, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara of Grafton Architects, and Jeannie Gang. Yet many architects remain undocumented and virtually unknown. Ethel Bailey Furman of Richmond, Virginia, for one, an African-American architect who designed over 200 buildings in her native city, a largely unknown and underrepresented in local, regional, state, and national archives. Most of her residential buildings are gone, the victim of urban renewal that demolished hundreds of Black neighborhoods across the country. This is a global story. The architects and the women who changed architecture hail from Israel, France, Italy, the UK, Spain, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Latvia, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Germany, Poland, Austria, Finland, Pakistan, India, Australia, South Africa, Mexico, Peru, Jamaica, Argentina, Japan, South Korea, and South Korea. 5 African-American architects and 4 Pritzker Prize recipients are featured. Worldwide, these women indelibly influenced the evolution of architecture across several decades. We organized the book around 6 generations of groundbreakers who practiced in distinctive social and economic circumstances, and each generation approached architectural practice in ways that both responded to their environment, and also introduced exceptional innovations that validated their practice and advanced the foundation for future generations of women to gain recognition. Throughout much of the 20th century, the professional practice of architecture was regarded generally as exclusive rather than inclusive of women practitioners and designers, as were most professions. Yet emerging even as early as the late 19th century, talented and daring women entered architectural practice, making solid strides toward acknowledgement and esteem. And it is our hope that this book will alter architectural history, becoming more inclusive of women, people of color, and individuals representing our world heritage. Earlier milestones advancing women in architecture include Susanna Torrey's 1977 exhibition at the Architectural League in New York City, Women in American Architecture, a historic and contemporary perspective, appearing in tandem with a book by the same name. And in 1998, the British Architects Journal established the Jane Drew Prize with the Royal Institute of British Architects to recognize innovation and creativity by female architects, and named after English architect Dame Jane Drew, the first female full professor at Harvard University and MIT. And in 2002, Beverly Willis, who wrote the book's foreword, founded the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, celebrating through education and research the very fact that women have changed design construction. Amale, you have written about the countless lists and compendia on women architects assembled in the last few years, and the many events and public conversations around women in design and architecture more broadly, more broadly on gender equity in the field in mainstream general interest magazines. Is there one architect who rises above all others for her celebrity status?
Thank you for this wonderful first synopsis of the book. It's funny when I was thinking about that on my way here. When you mention celebrity, of course you have Zaha Hadid, that still emerges, right? Prima donna, the woman with the guys, who I think was always presented as kind of transcending identity a little bit. But what I find so interesting is, as I'm thinking about it now, she is no longer up there alone. Like, there's so many names now that emerge, within a second, whereas before, you'd have to, it was and now you think, Liz Diller, Sejama, Mabel Wilson, Rosanna, it's just your tongue moves faster with the names. And for me, that's really hopeful, and it says something about, this kind of acceleration, which I think is really encouraging. It's not done yet, but there's definitely more out there, the Grafton architects, and so that for me is hopeful.
Yeah.
And also hopeful because you no longer have a single model of what it means.
Yes.
You have such many different ways of being present as a woman and as an architect, and I think that is really crucial. So we're not limiting ourselves, and we're undoing cliches about what it's supposed to be.
And as the immediate past dean of the Columbia School of Architecture and Planning and Preservation, you have a very personal understanding of what's happening in academia as well as professional schools. And let me just say, Amale was the first female dean of the Columbia School of Architecture, and brilliant.
Thank you. Again, I think that when I became dean, it was very clear to me that I was standing on the shoulders of Monica Ponce de Leon, at Michigan, and Sarah Whiting at Rice, and we were kind of like, after my appointment, a number of deans, women deans were appointed, and Mi Jae Yoon, Deborah Burke, Sarah Whiting was appointed to the GSD, and it just kind of opening, and I'm sorry, I just got back from Beirut, I'm a little bit jet lagged, but, and so again, I think there is a sense of acceleration that has happened in academia, with, when the Me Too movement exploded, and the impact in academia was really strong, with more demands for more faculty, more women faculty, more support for junior faculty, for recognition that it's very difficult to balance both. And I would say what's also, I think, important today in academia is that it's not just about gender. We need more Black professors, more brown professors, more Black women who are teaching, more Black students, more, so it's really about inclusivity, in a kind of very extensive way. And I think that the pressure, what's fantastic is that these demands and this pressure is coming from the students and the student body, and it's unstoppable. And even in the 7.5 years I was dean at GSAP, the transformation. Under Mark Wigley there was already a movement, but there was an acceleration in terms of the makeup of the faculty in particular, and I think that that's also very encouraging in terms of the academic world. We need to do more, but it's definitely sort of expanding.
You touched on the ascribed difference between being an architect and being a woman architect, and I think we're all disappointed to be reminded of the future Supreme Court justice being asked to define what is a woman, but this I know, but this is
sorry.
yeah, but this is actually something that women architects have been being asked and faced a lot in the last decade, and so how do you resolve that discrepancy?
I think that this discrepancy is really doesn't exist, right? It's completely constructed, and we spend our time undoing it, which is exhausting. But if you start with the Bauhaus and Gropius, you couldn't even be a woman and an architect, right? So he opens the door. If you're a woman, you can't see anything dimension. You're doing fabrics, and not that that's not architecture, by the way. The other thing is you want to expand what architecture is, but nevertheless, it's kind of a line. And then so at some I think there are kind of there's so many different areas of battle. One, you want to either negate being a woman so you can be an architect and say, I'm above that, or you want to expand what architecture is and say, this work is also architectural, or there are generations. That's why I love the book in terms of the kind of different battles and generations, where in the 90s it was about celebrating. Is there something called the feminine, or can that be a criticism? Can gender critique, sort of normative forms of architecture? So we're constantly trying to find entry points to undo this dichotomy, and at the same time, I think never wanting to be reduced to that battle either. At some point, you also want to be able to have the freedom to weave things together in the way that makes sense to you. And so at some point it's also just about numbers and opening the doors and having a flood, so that you can say it's not one model, it's really, this kind of diversity of voices and perspectives, and that you can't define and reduce, you can hold things together in many different ways
Yeah.
and not accept these, divisions that are constantly imposed, on us. I will say something of a very well-known male architect who will remain unnamed, but every time he sees me, he's like, "You're here, where are the kids?" I mean, this is like, and with the charm, and I don't mind, but it's odd,
the immediate association.
and so it's, and so you smile. He's like, "You're doing fine, thank you."
And when you pick up this book and you turn the pages, page after page after page, you see just the amazing, wonderful diversity of talent and ingenuity that each architect brought to the practice of architecture and to the profession. And so the book establishes an encyclopedic record of 122 pioneering women in architecture over 140 years, from 1881 to 2021, and as we said, organized in 6 generations. And I can trust that the record will continue to grow and develop with time and more research. This book registers the sheer number of architects who have shaped the discipline and the practice of architecture across the decades. Yet, no doubt, we cannot escape some critical questioning. For example, why these architects and not others? Why so many American architects, even with the international global representation? So against this backdrop, Amale, what do you believe to be the most interesting aspect of the book? That it should not be read as a chronology of women architects, but as a framework for understanding generations as well as individuals and the possibility of intergenerational shifts.
I think for me, the moment you make a book, there's an inside to that book and an outside, and there are questions about how that boundary was created, and I think that's a fair question, which hopefully produces a second book, and you keep kind of building. What I found to be the most interesting is exactly what you said, this is not just about indexing a kind of chronology, and like having just a list of names. I think that this is doing more than these lists that I was speaking about, in that I think the structure, the generational structure, sort of creates another framework, overlaid on the framework of women architects or women in architecture. And that framework says, there's another reading here, which is, how did one generation build on another generation? What are the concerns that were shared, given the context, the social, political, economic context, and the context of the kind of urban development, and I think that creates a frame where you can, it's not so much about the individual woman, but kind of what together at a certain moment they represent as a set of battles or boundaries, and of course each one is specific. They're not a collective. They don't. So there's both the specificity and the kind of shared concerns kind of horizontally in terms of a generation, and then the specificity and the shared concerns almost vertically from one generation to the next. And I think when you start reading the book that way, it's more about a set of relationships and how these concerns shift. And so I think that is what, for me, undermines this, what women architects are, or but of course, I think the question of why so many American architects, or I think these questions are fair. At the same time, it would be hard to establish these kinds of networks of shared concerns if you were stretching it too much, globally. And I think so that I think does allow for some depth. I think in the sharing.
Yeah, and the culture of the time of each generation really was an important framework for defining the generations, as we know, in our own lifetimes. So the first generation of architects in the book, born in the second half of the 19th century, who we call the groundbreakers, you perceive some fascinating contrasts among them, Amal, and can you tell us about what these contrasts were?
Yeah, first of all, I didn't know much about that generation, so for me it was really, anyone who dives into it, I mean, it's fascinating. What I think is interesting is that while some are really trying to battle academia and bring down the wall or the doors and try to enter, others are like, you know what, I'm just gonna apprentice here, I'm gonna, they find alternate modes of learning and building a practice, and for me that's fascinating, and it's so interesting because I think it reflects a little bit what I find is most exciting about practice today, which, I always think of the students are trying to piece things together in a way that makes sense for them to carve a position and a form of practice today in the world. And, when I think of that, the women of that generation are really building with a very strong cultural, political, and social concerns, which tend to, I would say that is actually something that in the book, I find there is a presence of that thread across generations. I don't think the women in the book, there is a kind of a social concern that sometimes in the way that architecture history is taught, there's these gaps where at some point it's like, this is an autonomous discipline, and you don't get that so much with the women. But if I think of the women's building at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, I mean, that's amazing to, they come together, women like Lois Lily Ho, Marion Honey Griffin, Julia Morgan, Eileen Rayleigh, Wright, Lillian Rice, Ena Marcio Alto, and Luther Maria Riggs, right? That's the generation.
Yes.
The fact that they come together to do this building and to talk about creative practices from the perspective of women. I mean, we don't even have that today.
Yeah.
So it's really, so that's a very pioneering moment.
That they were allowed to do it.
And that they were allowed to do it, yeah.
And so the second generation of architects who are coming of age in the first 3 decades of the 20th century had greater access to formal training and to formal precepts of modernism, while also noting how modernism's deployment as a university architectural style led to anything but universality. And this is Charlotte Perrion, Jane Drew, Lena Bobardi, Florence Noel Bassett, Ann Ting, Natalie DeBlois, Gertrude Purvis, among others. And in the third generation, coming of age in the pre-World War II era, you all witness a remarkable change in this third generation. Tell us about that.
Post-World War II?
They're coming of age in the pre-World War II, but they're
They're
practicing in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of them is right here, Sharon Sutton, and I think that
the Women's Warrior Group.
That's right, the Women's Warrior Group. That is right. There's just amazing activism in that generation. There's questions of, what is feminist space and form, and what would be a feminist organization or forms of education, and how do we open up a diversity of approaches to architecture, and that level of engagement, and together with Sharon, people like Phyllis Lambert, Debbie Willis, Alison Smithson, who really also brings back the social, and if you think about it, this is like Corbus's, the universal Asper Siam is over, we are grounding ourselves in the street and the
We're
people. And you mentioned Susana Torre and you know, many others, and that's a very activist generation.
Yeah, very
which is, you know, again, I think the social thread is there, but it's a different form, and the questions of the feminist, you know, practice or you know, emerges.
Yeah. And you know, I think of Adele Chatfield Taylor, who studied preservation at Columbia through the prism of architecture, and she chose Columbia just for that reason, not just being taught about the soft policy. And she was a real maverick in New York City in really building the preservation movement in New York City. And then she moved on to the American Academy in Rome, and she restored the beautiful estate that the Academy occupied, that was designed by McKim Meaden Wright White in 1909, circa 1909, 1910. So, you know, she's just been a major force in both preserving buildings and also developing art, and she's among your generation of mavericks. So the fourth generation of women whose college years overlap with the liberal 1960s and 70s traces second wave feminism in architecture as a new set of rising stars who embraced critical theory and confronted the patriarchal modernist control. Think Billy Chen, Elizabeth Plotter-Zyber, Toshiko Mori, Jill Lerner, Deborah Burke, Elizabeth Diller, Julie Eisenberg, Marion Weiss. They're among the architects who gave themselves the freedom to sample, to explore, and to hybridize from an open archive of art and architecture, engaging new technologies to produce bold forms and fresh approaches out of the existing traditions and histories that they had inherited. Yet, despite their strident successes, and they had many, this generation continued to wrestle with the struggle for equal recognition that women still face today. So what do you discover, Amal, with the women architects coming of age in the last few decades of the 20th century, yourself among them?
I think what's interesting about, you know, the generation you just mentioned is this kind of freedom, you know, and also embrace of technology, right? They're like, technology is not just for the guys, we're gonna, and there's this sort of desire to hybridize, you know, art and architecture and to kind of push the boundaries that way, and to really, critical theory is really, you know, important at that moment. I think for the, you know, I often, going back to the, you know, Zaha as the icon, Zaha never spoke about sexism or, let's say, being discriminated against as a woman until late in her career, where she started to say, you know, this, you know, I have to say something. And so I think my, you know, around my time, we're well aware of that, and that it's still not, you can't just deny your gender or your, you know, and on the contrary, I think there's a sense of wanting to use that to continue to blur the boundaries, not so much in theory, but in practice. You know, I think to look at intersections, you know, art and architecture, architecture and landscape, architecture and advocacy. You know, if I think of people like, there's such different, Claire Weiss or Yolanda Daniels or Mabel Wilson or Beneda Teclabuet or Jeannie Gang or Monica Ponce de Leon. Like, everybody is kind of saying, I want to put the pieces together the way I think is relevant today, and it's really pushing practice pushing forms of practice and not being limited in terms of how one practices or what, it's that you have to bring this discipline and this discipline together and you have to make something new, because whatever we're given is just, it's not enough to address what needs to be addressed today. And this weaving, this work, I think is really particular and interesting and different, and it kind of sort of stretches architecture and enhances it that way.
Yeah. And I think of Lori Brown's work with equity, diversity, and the women's centers in the north and the south, and Upali's work with developing design for different populations, whether it's women or gender studies or mature individuals. And so all of these permutations are now alive and well in architectural practice.
Yeah, just when we did our installation at PS1, which was an urban farm, I remember people were like, well, that's not architecture, like it's something else. And Claire is here, we hybridized, I was pushing practice in Claire Weiss in so many ways. And I think the idea that somebody with authority will say, this is not architecture, I think we've kind of are really undoing that. And just by doing that, you open up the possibilities of more inclusivity and diversity of perspectives and positions, and it's sort of scary for some because it's so decentered, but it's so good, right? Because we need to keep pushing that and kind of have new formations emerge.
You talked a little bit about the linear commonalities that cut across the generations, and you identified a number of strong patterns that emerge. So tell us a little bit about that.
So this is the kind of like the threads that I thought existed very clearly between the generations. Working collaborations and partnerships. Collaborations are everywhere. Whether they are amongst women architects or partnering with collaboration is really present. I think what we just discussed, which is constantly finding ways to challenge limits and boundaries, whether it's theoretical or in practice, and this notion that, because I think at the beginning, or sort of the women are outside, they're like, they have to create a space for themselves. Nobody's going to create that space, so they're picking up the threads and they're like this, like kind of carving, and I think so. This notion of everything is possible in terms of kind of creating these intersections. I think is really present, and as I said, I think there is really I found in terms of the way the book tells the stories, that there is an engagement always with the social, with the political, with the environmental. There is a concern with like lived reality, and also a love of history. I think, for example, preservation was very much led, by women in terms of the practice, and the love of history, I think, is also something that is present to a certain extent. And I think this movement of being on the outside and questioning whatever center is, and then you find yourself maybe centered, and then you have to decenter again, and I think that movement exists also across the generations. So how do you use one's kind of position and positionality to sort of push back on centers, but at the same time you don't never want to be reduced to just a constant effort, right? Like at some point you want to be able to just work, and that's so this tension between using, in this case, gender to question, but never being reduced to gender, I think is a constant. No one wants to just represent, right? And yet we are constantly asked or put in a position to do that. So
Definitions. I'd like to open up the question and answers at this time, but I'd also, before we close out this part of the program, I'd like to say that while Amal and I are up here representing the book, it is the result of the time and talent and at times seemingly endless commitment of many individuals, many women and a few men. And first and foremost are the architects who contributed their time, their commitment to this project. And I know there's a handful here this evening, and I'd just like to give them a round of applause. Also, the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, the book's co-publisher, has been a trustworthy partner and advocate in this endeavor. And special thanks goes to Beverly Willis herself, Julia Murphy, and Cynthia Pfeiffer-Krakauer. The principal contributors include Julie Sinclair Eakin, Catherine Flynn, and Laurel Francis Rogers, and so please acknowledge And I'd also like to thank Mary McLeod and Victoria Rossner of Columbia University, Sarah Alaback, who wrote the biographies of 12 early pioneers, as well as the introduction to the 19th century architects, as well as architect Doris Cole, women's historian Meg Vickery of UMass Amherst, Julia Gamelina, founder and editor-in-chief of Madam Architect, Lori Brown of Syracuse University, as well as Princeton Architectural Press, the team at the press at the time, Jennifer Thompson, Kristen Hewitt, Paul Wagner, Natalie Snodgrass, and publisher Lynn Grady, as well as Stephanie Holstein, now of Biden. So thank you, one and all, and now we can open it up to questions.
If you have a question, just put your hand up and I can also bring you the mic if you need it.
Yes.
One question, so I was involved in this project, but just to hear a little bit more about your guys' collaboration. I do really love the framework that you guys built out, but I'm curious, like in those early conversations, how you thought about creating that framework, making those chapter divisions.
When Amal and I first talked 4 years ago, I think I then had in mind the 6 generations, but that was not set in stone because the press works on a collaborative basis, and we were still discussing whether the 6 generations was the ideal delineation for the book. So we talked about that. We talked about the selection process of the architects and strong portfolios, important contributions, but not every featured architect in the book had the construct of an architectural practice, and they were more social activists and yet made huge contributions to the field of women practicing in architecture. So it was really about the contribution, and we started with 50 architects, and then we said, no, we expanded it to 100, and then I was coming up with more, and I thought, you know what, I'm not gonna put an arbitrary limit on this, and it rose to 122, and today it could be much more than that.
you also organized these calls.
Oh, that's right.
We had a
That's
series
right.
of calls with
That's
some
right.
of the contributors.
That's right.
to try to, when you were testing the generation idea, and to almost, and we all did research, we had we had assignments, just, is there something there? Can we, almost like, both research, but also a kind of, if I give you these names in that generation, what emerges as, and you were trying to see whether that framework, in fact, was something that you can build on. And I thought those comments, because you had really great questions, and I thought, and we were a multi-generational,
Yes.
and kind of small group, so I think those conversations were really helpful to start to articulate what was in common, what was different, and if that structure kind of made sense. And I thought these were really great.
I had forgotten about those, but yes, I remember. So the authors for the introductions to the 6 generations did a lot of research about the architects in their generation, who they are, and the cultural aspects, and then actual achievements, and it helped to really define and clarify for us the structure of the book.
So full disclosure, I'm a librarian, and that informs my question. So, language is very sensitive and it changes over time. You have inclusively referenced women who were understood as designers, but that labeling of women as designers versus women who are architects greatly informs some of the generations that you include. Can you speak a little bit about how you were able to, with consistency, apply that filter, and what your insights were about how the design and architecture fields inclusive of women evolved with language moving alongside it?
I'll start. I'm thinking of Charlotte Perriand, I'm thinking of Frances Noel Bassett, I'm thinking of Lily Reich, and when I think about these designers, they're also architects. So that maybe their biggest contribution was in design, interior design, but they were architects as well, and they practiced architecture. And so, their framework was both architectural space and furniture. And also there is a lot, I'm thinking of, I'm not gonna get this right, I'm not gonna say who it is, but they were also involved in the analytics of how a space was used, and how the human being, usually the woman in the kitchen, functioned in that space, and trying to make it as humane and functional as possible.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we still, this debate is still here today. I mean, I had faculty meetings of like, is this architecture? But you go up to present a tenure case, and they're like, how is that architecture? And you're like, well, let's see. Architecture is a practice that includes writing, drawing, building, designing, and you're constructing. It's a spatial practice. Now, some people will question that, but I think the way you framed it is, if design had a spatial practice component, then it seemed you were making it inclusive, a kind of architecture, designer as, as architect. And then it seems to me that you also had some, if these women were pushing the boundary, and, if you're, for example, the inside and outside, the interior being feminine, and, so to undo that, you have to make the design of the interior, architecture. It's spatial, it's material, it's, so.
I'm also thinking of Alto And she was an architect who also was very involved in product design, her glassware line. And so we were really careful about selecting women who were architects, though they flourished in design as well. So it's a hard librarian question. It's imprecise.
I think one of the reasons that I was motivated to ask it is because I was listening to the criteria that you were applying, and so if these women were not recognized as architects, but we understand that what they were doing was the work of architecture, and some of this is discovery, how were you able to, or did you find yourself bringing women over that imaginary line in order to give them their due recognition and visibility?
But they also were recognized as architects. I'm thinking of Lily Bright, who designed with Mies van der Rohe, and she was very involved in the design of his furniture, but she was also very involved in the design of the Barcelona Pavilion. So, Marcina Alto, she was very involved in designing buildings, even while she was, she really prospered in her tabletop designs. So,
I just have one follow-up comment on that. It seems by and large that a lot of these women became better known for their interiors rather than their participation in like the shell of the building or that form of architecture, and I think that was a very historically gendered way of like delineating and dividing up that labor. So again, involved like someone like Alto or Charlotte Camion were participating in these buildings, they nonetheless became known primarily for their like interior design work.
individually, yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm thinking Ann Ting, who was an architect and contributed to buildings. Some of her best work is her geometric sculptures and her studies in that way. So she's very much remembered for both, but maybe more singularly for her sculptural studies.
Yes.
Well, do you think there's also, just building on these comments, that there's also kind of a boomerang effect that as women, were known and kind of siloed as women of the house, they're the one that does the interior decor. Understandably, women moved into architecture, wanted to be seen as more professional, but did it kind of leave behind the kind of core of placemaking that women very wonderfully own in crafts, in design itself. So did we go from one extreme to another? I'm just putting that out.
That's a really interesting, comment. I think that, I don't know, it is possible that I'm, again, thinking about the generational, framework, it is possible that when I think of the generation of Zaha Hadid or Liz Diller or Marion Weiss, or, it may be that this is a moment of like, claiming technology, claiming building, claiming, right? There's a sort of, I don't know if it leaves behind but there is a like, we can do, we want to do towers and we want to do, don't put us in a little box. That is, or merging with landscape, right? So suddenly we're not just moving outside, we're saying the outside is ours and we can, right? I mean, if I think of Zaha, Mary, the landscape and the city is a kind of movement to own the city and intersecting with planning and, so but I think there are these shifts, and then people come back and say, well, but, the generation after says, well, and again, I'm being very didactic about the generation, but, let's weave it together in different ways, right? Let's, so things are maybe left behind for a little moment to expand and kind of redefine and stretch, and then they're brought, they're brought back in, and context is very important too. I mean, if you're working in a city like New York, there's no boundary between the interior and the architecture. I mean, so I think it's the freedom to be able to choose at the end of the day and not, have to be confined to a space or a scale or a form of practice that is supposed to be a kind of, woman zone. So, yeah, that is interesting.
I can't add much to it. What I'm thinking about is Natalie DeBlois, who was a senior designer who worked with Gordon Bunshaft on major SOM projects in New York City, and always credited to Gordon Bunshaft, and yet Natalie DeBlois was the person doing, the major part of the work, and she was remarkable. So, I think both were happening, and it's really a question of what individual circumstances were and how one was able to fulfill their personal and artistic ambitions. And I think that's still happening.
Yeah. So as you were speaking about the book, you were speaking about how you broke it down through generations. Now I'm thinking about the next generation. So what are your hopes with this book for the next generation to take forward in terms of academic, institution, professionally? Just like, what are your thoughts with this platform that you've created?
Well, first, that's a really great question, and I think it's inspiration and aspiration, and the 140 years shows that there's a lot that happens in each period of time, and it builds and builds and builds to where we are today. And I think the young generation will probably really focus on the work of Amale's generation and maybe the one earlier, because many, I'm looking around the room, there's still a lot of women in the earlier generations who are, really in the center of practice. So, and those names will be relevant and known to young architects. So they can, I think it's really just learning about what each architect, with the path of each architect, and the diversity of that.
Yes, and I think, books like these are incomplete, and so it's an invitation to build on them, and it's an archive, and it's, it's about offering other models, alternate models, different models, and throughout, and not just here in the U.S., but there are around the world. I mean that would be, there are places around the world where there's very few, women architects, or and so I think it's an archive to build on. It's also, honestly, how many times, we were talking about the list, a faculty putting a syllabus together, and these things are so crucial to start to change the conversation and offer different models. I think that's really important, and inspiration, and to say there's no one way. Here are 122 ways, that are not, most of them are not the usual way or the normative way, or and they create kind of new possibilities. Yeah.
Julie? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to make I agree with
is true of academics, I think, you know, in general, and a lot of these people are academics, but the practitioners too, very enthusiastic about, not covetous about the things that they've learned, but willing to bring you along, willing to provoke you. To me, that was,
Yeah, I'd like to think that, for sure. You know, I think a lot of the, if I think of, you know, conversations in the last few years and, you know, the importance of mentorship and kind of really caring for the next generation, and you don't, it's not just in your teaching in academia, but in one's office, and you know, I do think that that's really, for a long time, women felt we didn't have mentors or models, and I think that effort is really important, and I would hope that is there. You know, this idea that you have to kind of lift the next generation, and you know, one thing that is little known about someone like Zaha Hadid because of the image of this prima donna, and you know, she really had in her office, I know because some of my students had worked for her, she was really a mentor to many young women in the office, especially Middle Eastern women, Iraqi women, or Lebanese. You know, there was a kind of, she had that side to her that was kind of very uncharacteristic of how she's been depicted. So I think that's a nice comment to certainly inspire to.
So it is a little after 7, and this would be a great time to take a break, buy some books, and Amale and I would be happy to sign them, as well as, you know, we have Julia Eakin here. We have others, and so, you know, if you wanted to, and the contributors had time, or the architects had time, you know, we can also collect some autographs from the other contributors to the book, as well as the architects. So it's an opportunity, assuming we haven't organized this, so assuming that people are interested and it's going to be good. But
organic autographing.